Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The year was 2004. On the surface, it was the kind of place where life moves at a familiar pace. Humid afternoons, quiet streets, people who recognize each other at gas stations and grocery stores. The kind of town where family ties are supposed to mean something, where kin is not just a word, but a bond. That is what made this case feel like a contamination, because the first victim was not a stranger. He was part of the circle. Vernon Hewlett was related to Roger Gillette's family, the kind of connection that usually brings people closer during hard times, not closer to danger. Vernon had a girlfriend, Linda Heinzelman, and together they stepped into a situation they had no reason to treat as a trap. But in the home Lisa Jo Chamberlain shared with Roger Gillette, something had shifted. The atmosphere was not domestic. It was Investigators would later describe the motive in plain terms: greed, resentment, and control. A private decision made behind closed doors, where two people convinced each other that the lives in front of them were obstacles, not human beings. When Vernon and Linda vanished, the story did not begin with sirens. It began with questions. Family members asked where Vernon was. Friends wondered why no one could reach Linda. The absence was heavy, but it was not yet criminal in the public mind. People disappear for all kinds of reasons, until the pattern gets too sharp to ignore. That is when law enforcement began pulling at the thread. The deeper they looked, the stranger the details became. Not just where Vernon might have gone, but who had been around him, who had access, who benefited from his silence. And that is where Lisa Jo Chamberlain and Roger Gillette came into focus. What made the case stand out was not only that two people were gone, it was the deliberate effort to make sure they stayed gone. Not just hidden, but erased. The kind of decision that does not come from panic. It comes from planning. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the couple's actions were not limited to Hattiesburg. The trail stretched beyond Mississippi, moving across state lines in a way that told detectives one thing: this was not an impulsive act. It was a coordinated effort to distance themselves from what they had done in court. Prosecutors laid out a picture of partnership in its darkest form. This was not a single offender dragging someone else along. This was a pair moving as one. Two adults sharing the same secret, making the same choices, reinforcing each other's worst instincts. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The kind of evidence that does not leave room for a misunderstanding defense. The kind that makes a courtroom go quiet as jurors realize they are not listening to rumor, but to reality. And then came the final twist that sealed Lisa Jo Chamberlain into a unique place in Mississippi. Criminal history. Because when the court process ended and the sentencing reality set in, Chamberlain became the only woman on Mississippi's death row, a title no one earns by accident. Roger Gillette, by contrast, was sentenced to life without parole. No future hearings that changed the outcome. No second life outside prison walls. Just a permanent sentence designed to answer a permanent act. The gavel did what the community needed it to do. It drew a line. Lisa Jo Chamberlain was sent to death row. Roger Gillette was locked away for life without parole. And the promise Mississippi made to the public was simple. Whatever bond these two offenders thought they had forged, it would not survive the steel doors and concrete that now separate them from the world. But the final word in this story does not belong to the it belongs to Vernon Hewlett and Linda Heinzelman, the two people who walked into the orbit of family and never walked out again. They were not headlines. They were lives with routines, relationships, and futures that should have continued past 2004 instead. Their names became a warning, because some people do not destroy strangers. They destroy their own circle. They take what is closest, what is easiest to reach, and they call it opportunity. And that is the echo that lingers after the sentencing. Not just what happened, but the kind of trust that was exploited to make it possible. Camden, Mississippi. The year was 2018. Camden is the kind of place where the past feels close. Old trees, long roads, front porches that have heard decades of family stories. In a town like this, people notice patterns. They notice when a driveway stays empty. They notice when the lights are off for too long. And they notice when a home that used to hold voices suddenly holds nothing but silence. Walter Simpson lived inside that kind of silence. To the outside world, his home looked ordinary. A household with routines. A marriage that, like many, probably carried its share of stress behind the curtain. But the people closest to him would later learn a brutal truth. The danger was not outside the front door. It was already in the living room, wearing a familiar face. Inside that home were two people who should have been safest under his roof. His wife, Falonda, and his stepdaughter. In the aftermath, investigators would describe the scene as not just violence, but intent. Not just harm, but finality. The evidence suggested a man who did not simply lash out and then panic. It suggested a man who wanted the story to end in a way that left no witnesses and no future. When the alarm finally reached law enforcement, it was not treated as a misunderstanding. It was treated as what it was, a family home turned into a crime scene. As detectives worked the timeline, the picture sharpened. They pieced together the last known movements, the last points of contact, the last moments when anyone outside that house believed everything was still normal. In cases like this, the contrast is always the same. One day is ordinary. The next day becomes a permanent headline. Walter Simpson's name moved from husband to suspect, quickly, not because of rumor, but because of what the investigation uncovered. The kind of facts that do not bend, the kind that do not disappear when someone tries to deny them. When the truth is physical, denial becomes just another lie. And Simpson did what so many family destroyers do. He tried to control the narrative. He tried to shape the story into something softer than the reality. But the mask slip always comes. It comes when timelines do not match. It comes when evidence refuses to align with the version being offered. It comes when professionals who have seen every excuse recognize the same pattern again. A household argument is not a defense. A rough season is not a defense. A bad day is not a defense, because there are lines you do not cross when you are a protector. And Walter Simpson crossed them. By the time the case reached court, the focus was no longer on whether something happened. The focus was on accountability. Prosecutors presented the case as a deliberate annihilation of a household, a decision to remove two lives and leave a home as a shell. The courtroom heard the names, again and again, Falonda, Devonda, not as characters, but as people whose futures were stolen where they should have been safe. And when the time came for sentencing, the state of Mississippi did what the community demanded it do. Walter Simpson was sentenced to life without parole. No, maybe later. No hope of bargaining for freedom after the headlines fade. No future where he gets to rebuild a life after destroying theirs. Just a cage, because a man who turns his own home into a place of terror does not deserve the comfort of a second chance. Philanda and Devonda do not get to return to the life they were living before 2018. They do not get to step back into their routines. They do not get to reclaim the years that were stolen from them. But the court made sure Walter Simpson will never reclaim his either. And that is the quiet truth behind the sentence. The world outside keeps turning, but the person who shattered that house will watch it from behind bars, season after season, with nothing left to control. Rankin County, Mississippi. The year was 2024. A family home is supposed to be a boundary line. It is supposed to separate the chaos of the outside world from the safety of the inside. It is supposed to be the place where a mother can exhale, where a stepfather can come home, where a teenager can be difficult and moody and still protected by the walls around them. But sometimes those walls do not protect anyone. Sometimes they trap the victim with the threat. Carly Madison Gregg was 15 years old, a teenager, a daughter, a name that should have been attached to school days arguments over chores and the ordinary friction of growing up. Instead, her name became attached to a level of cold calculation that stunned her. Community. Her mother was Ashley Smiley, and in the aftermath, the case did not unfold like a tragic accident. It unfolded like a planned betrayal, with one chilling detail at its center: communication. Because this was not only about what happened inside a home, it was about what happened after. It was about the moment when most people would collapse, panic, or run. Instead, investigators alleged something far darker, according to the case presented. After Ashley Smiley did not survive, Carly used her mother's phone, not to call for help, not to plead for rescue, but to send messages that created a trap, pulling her stepfather toward the house under false pretenses. That detail mattered because it showed intent. It showed a mind not spiraling in confusion, but moving with purpose. It showed a person using the most normal object in modern life, a phone, as a tool of manipulation. The mask slip, in this case, was not a dramatic confession. It was the contrast between what the home should have been and what the evidence suggested it became. A domestic space turned into a staged scenario. A family thread turned into a lure. When law enforcement stepped in, they did what they always do in cases like this. They reconstructed. They measured time. They compared statements to digital footprints. They looked for consistency. Because truth is consistent, even when it is ugly. And what they found, prosecutors argued, was a story that could not be explained away as teenage rebellion or mood swings, or a bad argument taken too far. Because I was upset does not account for deliberate steps taken afterward. Because I did not mean it does not explain calculated communication. Because the words on a screen do not carry emotion unless someone types them. As the case moved through the system, the community wrestled with the same question people always ask. When a family turns on itself, how does a mother raise a daughter for 15 years, and then face the unthinkable inside her own home? There is no answer that makes it make sense. There is only the truth that some do not look like strangers. Sometimes they share your last name. Sometimes they live down the hall. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table. And then comes the only part of the story that feels like order returning the gavel. Carly Madison. Greg was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence built for one purpose: to ensure that the person accused of turning a family home into a hunting ground does not get to walk back into another neighborhood and pretend it was just a phase. Ashley Smiley does not get to grow older. She does not get to rebuild. She does not get to see how her life could have unfolded past 2004-24. But the court ensured Carly's future will unfold inside a correctional system, not outside it. And that is the silent echo that lingers. Not only the loss of a mother, but the collapse of the most basic trust a family is built on. Because the most terrifying betrayal is not the one that kicks in the door. It is the one that already has a key. Clay County, Mississippi. The winter of 2026. Clay County is the kind of place where the night has a sound. Not sirens and engine crickets, distant dogs, a television humming in a trailer window. Roads run between pine lines and open fields. People know which truck belongs to which driveway, and if a porch light flips on after midnight, someone notices. On a Friday night in early January, that quiet pattern snapped. Investigators say Derica Moore, a young man from West Point, became the center of a that unfolded across multiple locations in the same county. Different homes, different families. One thread tying it together. The people who died were not strangers. They were connected to him by blood, by proximity, by familiarity. The kind of familiarity that normally protects you in a small town. The first scene, authorities allege, was a residence where members of Moore's own family lived. When deputies arrived later, they found 3 relatives gone: his father, his brother, and his uncle. A house that should have been the safest place on earth for them had become the first stop in a chain of violence. From there, the night did not calm down. It accelerated. Sheriff's deputies and investigators would later describe the events as a moving crisis calls coming in, locations stacking up, confusion spreading faster than information. A vehicle connected to the early part of the ram was reported taken. Then another scene emerged. Then another. By the time the county realized what it was dealing with, the damage was already historic. Authorities allege that Moore's path eventually led to a second home where a young relative was killed in front of others. In that instant, whatever explanations people reach for: anger, jealousy, panic, impulse stop sounding like explanations at all. Because nothing rationalizes a decision that erases a life that had barely begun. The violence, investigators say, did not end there. It pushed onward, again toward a church property. Toward people who were not just names in a family tree, but pillars in a local community. A pastor and the pastor's brother were later found gone as well, pulling grief outward like a ripple from one family to multiple families to an entire county. At that point, Clay County was no longer in shock. It was in survival mode. Roadblocks, alerts, officers scanning the dark for headlights that did not belong. The kind of night where everyone keeps their phone in their hand. waiting for the next message to tell them whether the danger is closer or farther away. Authorities say Moore was ultimately stopped at a roadblock before midnight, not after days, not after a nationwide man. That same night, that same county, the same roads he had been traveling in court. The story became a list of charges that reads like a storm report, capital murder among them, along with other serious counts tied to the sequence of events. A judge ordered an evaluation and held him without bail due to the capital charge. The district attorney signaled an intention to seek the harshest penalty allowed under Mississippi law if the case reaches that outcome. For now, Moore remains incarcerated, awaiting the long, grinding process that follows when a community demands answers and the courts demand proof. And that is the part people misunderstand about cases like this. The night itself is fast, but accountability is slow. It takes hearings, filings, motions, evidence. It takes survivors sitting in rooms they never wanted to enter, hearing names spoken in formal voices. It takes years, sometimes, for the final sentence to be carved into the record. But Clay County does not need a verdict to understand what was taken, because when a family loses a father, a brother, an uncle, and then watches the tragedy spread to a house down the road and a church in the same county, it does not feel like a single crime. It feels like the ground underneath you has been altered. And the cruelest part is this: the people who died that night will never get to see the after. They will never see who grew up, who healed, who moved away, who stayed. Their futures were erased in hours. If the court ultimately cages Derica Moore for the rest of his life, if the state seeks to end his Clay County, will still be left with the same question that haunts every family. A case. How does someone look at their own people and decide they are expendable? Jackson County, Mississippi. The fall of 1994, Pascagoula sits near the water, where the Gulf air makes everything feel slightly unfinished salt on metal. Humidity in the walls, streetlights glowing through mist. It is a working place, shipyards, long shifts, families trying to keep order in homes that carry the daily pressure of money, control, and routine. Inside one home in Jackson County, that routine collapsed into one of the most notorious family murders in Mississippi's modern history. Stephen McGilbury was a teenager, old enough to drive, old enough to make choices, young enough to still be treated, legally and emotionally, as someone who might be redeemable. What he did would test that idea for decades. Investigators and prosecutors would later allege the crime was not a sudden explosion, not a single strike in a moment of rage. They described it as a methodical act that moved through the household, leaving multiple family members gone. The victims were the core of his home life, his mother and his stepfather, and then a very young family member, taken in the same sequence, turning the crime from domestic homicide into something darker. Full collapse of the protective boundary that family is supposed to represent. The case turned quickly from something terrible happened to the person responsible is still out there, because after the murder, McGilbury did not call for help. He did not stay and spiral into remorse. He left. That decision became the first mask slip the moment the story stopped being about a tragedy and became about a trying to outrun consequences. In the hours that followed, prosecutors said he drove around, blending into ordinary life while carrying the secret weight of what he had done. Then law enforcement closed in. When the case reached court, the state laid out the narrative, the home, the victims, the calculated aftermath, and the effort to move on as if nothing had happened. The details were heavy enough that the courtroom did not need theatrics. The facts were the horror. A jury convicted Stephen McGilberry. And because the crime involved multiple victims inside a family setting, the sentence was severe, life imprisonment, the kind of punishment designed to remove someone from society permanently. But then the law shifted under his feet. Years later, America's courts began re-examining extreme sentences imposed on juveniles, especially life terms, without meaningful review. It did not erase guilt. It did not rewrite what happened in that home. But it changed how states could sentence teenagers for the worst crimes. So, McGilberry's punishment entered a second chapter. Hearings, legal arguments about what a teenager is on, what a teenager becomes after decades behind bars. The result still kept him caged for life in practical terms, but the legal framing changed, shaped by rulings that forced states to acknowledge youth as a factor even when the crime is monstrous. And there is a particular cruelty in that for the surviving relatives, because the victims do not get their lives do not get a second hearing. Their names do not get to walk back into a courtroom and ask for the years they were supposed to have. McGilberry, on the other hand, gets time, years, appeals, proceedings, a long paper trail. That is why family murder cases like this do not fade in places like Pascagoula, because the community does not just remember the crime. They remember the feeling, the moment everyone realized the danger was not outside the neighborhood. It was inside a house, behind a familiar door, carried out by someone who ate at the same table. And when the state says life, what it is really trying to do is draw a line. You crossed a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. You shattered a home into evidence. You turned family into a crime scene, so you will never fully rejoin the world you chose to terrorize. That is the never see freedom again promise in its purest form, not revenge, but removal. A locked door between the and everyone else, so the rest of the county can try, slowly, to breathe again. Rankin County, Mississippi. The year was 2017. In the pine woods and small roads outside Brookhaven, life runs on routine. Church on Sunday. Family cookouts. Kids playing in yards where everyone knows the last name on the mailbox. But on one violent night in late May, that sense of safety collapsed in a matter of hours, and an entire county learned what it means when rage turns into a roaming disaster. Willie Corey Godbolt was a man already known for volatility. The people around him described a pattern, arguments that escalated fast, threats that sounded too real, a temper that did not cool down once it caught fire. And when a domestic dispute erupted over access to his kids, Godbolt did not walk away. He went looking for control, the only way he knew how, force. The first stop was his in-laws' home. The argument was not just loud, it was a fuse. And when the fuse reached the powder, the night became a moving crime scene. Authorities would later lay it out as a across multiple locations. stretching across the same roads that families drive every day without thinking twice. The violence did not stay contained. It traveled. It followed him from one house to another, leaving a trail that felt unreal to the people listening to scanners and watching patrol cars race past. Deputies responded, trying to locate him, trying to stop the bleeding before it spread again. One of the was a deputy sheriff who stepped into the chaos and never stepped back out. Another was Godbolt's mother-in-law. Family members, relatives by marriage, and people connected by nothing more than proximity were swept into the same storm. By the time the night ended, 8 people were gone. And then came the part that turned the stomach of the entire region, the cold explanations. Investigators said Godbolt spoke as if the destruction was a message, a way to punish, a way to force the world to react. He even suggested he expected police to end the standoff with his own death, as if the final scene of the night was supposed to be a dramatic exit. But the system did not give him that ending. Instead, he was captured, alive, brought into court, and made to face what he had done in a courtroom full of empty chairs that should have held the living. The prosecution built a case around the scope and sequence of the spree, how it began with a domestic conflict, how it expanded into multiple homes, how it resulted in multiple murders, and how it left a deputy in the line of duty. Jurors heard the timeline, the call logs, the statements, and the wreckage left behind in living rooms and driveways. A jury convicted Willie Corey Godbolt of multiple counts, including capital murder. And when the sentencing phase arrived, Mississippi did not hesitate. The court sentenced Willie Corey Godbolt to death. Additional sentences stacked on top of that outcome, reflecting the number of victims and the number of crimes committed in a single night. He was sent to Mississippi's death row, caged in the state penitentiary, where the days are long and the future is not his to decide. In places like Rankin County, family is supposed to be the anchor, the thing that pulls you back when life tries to drag you under. But Godbolt turned family into a battleground and left a crater where trust used to live. The people he killed will never come back to their tables, their jobs, their routines, their futures. And the man who chose that path now lives inside a system designed for one purpose: to ensure he can never terrorize another home again. Sunflower County, Mississippi. The year was 2013. The Delta has a certain quiet to it at night. Long stretches of road, fields that disappear into darkness, and homes where people believe the worst danger is a storm rolling in off the horizon. But sometimes the danger comes in a car, with familiar last names and shared blood, moving together like a crew that has rehearsed its cruelty. Lamarcus Wallace, Patrick Wallace, Kerry Wallace. 3 brothers who did not just share a family name, they shared a plan. And on a night that ended in a murder, they acted as a unit, coordinated and deliberate, the kind of teamwork usually reserved for something productive. They used it for the opposite. Investigators said the target was a man named Christopher Burnett. This was not a random clash between strangers. This was an invasion, a home turned into a trap, a life reduced to a decision made by 3 men who believed fear could be used like a tool. The case that followed exposed what Sunflower County residents dread most: the idea that the people who destroy a home can be the same people who grew up down the road, people whose faces might have been familiar in a store or at a gas station. When brothers move together, when they reinforce each other's worst instincts, it creates a kind of momentum that is hard to stop once it starts. The investigation focused on how the brothers operated as a group. The state argued this was a coordinated attack tied to robbery, carried out with lethal intent. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, piece by piece, how the men entered, how the victim was controlled, how the scene showed planning rather than panic, and how the outcome was irreversible. Christopher Burnett did not get a fair chance. He did not get to negotiate his way out. He did not get mercy. He became the proof of what happens when multiple decide a human being is just an obstacle. A Sunflower County jury found Lamarcus Wallace, Patrick Wallace, and Carrie Wallace guilty of capital murder. Each brother was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, no early release, no second chance, no future outside the wire. There is a special kind of darkness in crimes committed by a pack because responsibility gets shared like a weapon. Each brother can tell himself a story about who led, who followed, who would have stopped if things changed. The court cut through that excuse. It treated them as what they chose to be that night, a coordinated threat. Christopher Burnett's life ended because three brothers decided to take what was not theirs to take. And now the state of Mississippi has ensured the only thing they have left is time, measured in decades. Inside a cage they will never walk out of. Case 8. Kendra Beck and Tokota Miller. The Starvation Parents, Poplarville, Mississippi. The year was 2021. Poplarville is the kind of place where people still wave from porches, where a drive to the grocery store can turn into 3 conversations you did not plan to have. It is small enough that trouble does not hide well, and yet some of the worst suffering can happen in a home that looks ordinary from the road. Kendra Beck and Tokota Miller were living a life that had quietly collapsed inward. The warning signs were not subtle, but they were contained behind closed doors. Instability, isolation, and a home environment that investigators would later describe as extreme neglect. They were parents, and in the eyes of the law, that title comes with one basic responsibility above all else: provide care. Instead, authorities said the household became a place where basic needs were ignored long past the point of emergency. There were 2 little ones in the home. One was still an infant, only a few months old, completely dependent on adults for everything. The other was a toddler, old enough to move around the house, but not old enough to protect himself from the conditions he was trapped in when help finally arrived. It was not because Beck and Miller called for it in time. The system came in after the damage was already done. Deputies and medical personnel walked into a scene that did not look like a single bad day. It looked like a long pattern, a slow, grinding failure of care that became impossible to deny. The infant did not survive, and the details that followed were some of the most difficult facts a jury can ever hear, because they are not about a sudden act of violence. They are about repeated decisions, day after day, hour after hour. A choice to delay, a choice to ignore, a choice to let a fragile life deteriorate instead of stepping forward for help. Investigators focused on 2 things: what the home conditions showed and what the timeline suggested about responsibility. Prosecutors argued this was not a tragic accident. It was reckless and intentional neglect so severe that it crossed into capital murder territory under Mississippi law. Charge matters. Capital murder is not filed lightly. It is reserved for cases where the state believes the conduct was so extreme, so depraved, and so clearly avoidable that the maximum punishment is justified in court filings. The state alleged the parents' actions and inaction created a lethal outcome. They also alleged the toddler living in the same environment was subjected to severe neglect and squalor. A surviving witness to a household where basic human care had been abandoned. When the public hears parents, they imagine protection. But Beck and Miller became the opposite. The people closest to the victim were the ones the state says caused the fatal outcome. The home, which should have been the safest place in the world, became the crime scene. As of the current posture of the case, Kendra Beck and Dakota Miller have been charged with capital murder. That means they are incarcerated while the case proceeds, facing the possibility of the harshest sentence Mississippi can impose if convicted. There are crimes that feel loud, like explosions that leave instant wreckage. And then there are crimes like this, where the horror is quieter, a life measured in days that should have been filled with care, instead marked by deprivation. The court cannot restore what was taken. It can only do one thing now: place the people accused of causing it behind bars, and make sure the community understands this truth. Evil is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it is neglect wearing the mask of normal life. Case 9, Natasha Graham and Ronald Hartfield, the dog leash CIO NSP, Lamar County, Mississippi. The year was 2008 in Lamar County. The roads are long, and the nights can feel quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. Most people imagine that the most dangerous threat, but the case of Natasha Graham and Ronald Hartfield was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who knows the schedule, the routines, and exactly how to make a disappearance look like anything other than what it is. Tabitha Hartfield was a wife and a mother. She had a life with a familiar shape, family responsibilities, daily habits, and the assumption that the people closest to her were the people she could trust. That assumption became her vulnerability. Ronald Hartfield was living a double life. Behind the scenes, he was involved with Natasha Graham, and according to prosecutors, that relationship was not just an affair. It became the engine of a plan. The state's theory was blunt. Ronald wanted Tabitha gone, and Natasha was willing to help make that happen. This was not framed as a moment of spontaneous rage. It was framed as a conspiracy, a coordinated effort involving more than one person, with the victim placed in the middle of an ugly triangle of betrayal. When Tabitha was reported missing, the early days carried the familiar chaos of uncertainty. Family members searched. Questions spread through the community. But law enforcement followed the patterns that rarely lie. Who benefits? Who had conflict? Who is suddenly changing their story? Investigators began to pull at the threads. Ronald's statements were examined. Timelines were compared. And then the case turned from missing person to homicide investigation. Prosecutors alleged that Tabitha's death was not only intentional, but carried out in a way designed to silence her permanently and remove the obstacle she represented. The twist was not just the girlfriend. The twist was the teamwork, The state argued this was a family betrayal, with two people leaning into the same outcome, one to remove a spouse, the other to claim a place that was never hers to take. In the story, the prosecution presented, Tabitha was not killed by a stranger. She was targeted by the people who knew her best. During the court process, the jury heard about coordination, opportunity, and post-crime behavior that prosecutors argued showed guilt rather than grief. They also heard about a key detail that became infamous in public discussion: a blue dog leash, cited as part of the evidence in how the killing was carried out. Even without repeating the physical mechanics, the image stuck with people because it symbolized something chilling: an everyday object repurposed into something monstrous. The outcome was decisive. Ronald Hartfield and Natasha Graham were convicted, and the court imposed life imprisonment. Not a term of years, not a sentence that fades with time. Life. They are now living the same. Reality. Every long sentence creates a calendar that no longer belongs to them, a future measured in locked doors and counted days. Some crimes are driven by greed, some by rage, and some by a colder motive: replacement. The idea that a person can be erased so someone else can step into their life like a new outfit. Tabitha Hartfield was not an obstacle. She was a human being with a future that should have been protected by the vows spoken to her. Instead, the people closest to her became the threat. And now, the only certainty left in this story is the one the court delivered. The conspirators who helped destroy her life will spend their own lives behind bars. Case 10. Luke Woodham, The Pearl, M.A., Mississippi. The year was 1997. Pearl sits just outside Jackson, a place built on routines. Church on Sunday. Ball games after school. Familiar roads that never feel dangerous because everyone thinks they know who lives behind every door. In the spring of 1997, that sense of safety collapsed in a way the community would never forget. Not because of a storm, not because of an outsider, but because a teenage son decided the person who raised him was the first barrier he needed to remove. Luke Woodham was 16 years old. To classmates, he blended into the background until he did not. To adults, he was a name on a roster, a face in a hallway. But inside his home, there was conflict, resentment, and a growing obsession with control. Investigators would later argue that the anger he carried was not just emotional, it was strategic. He was not thinking about consequences. He was thinking about obstacles. Mary Woodham was his mother, the primary authority figure in the household, the person whose job was to guide him, correct him, and keep him within lines that teenagers often test. In the mind of a disturbed boy, that authority became the enemy. What happened inside the Woodham home was not framed as an accident. It was framed as deliberate. Prosecutors described it as an act meant to eliminate the one adult who could have stopped him, confronted him, or forced him to change course. This is where many true crime stories become graphic. But the clearest way to understand the horror without turning it into a scene is to look at what the justice system focused on: intent and sequence. First, the home became the first crime scene. Then, the day escalated into what would become one of the most notorious incidents in Mississippi history: the Pearl High School attack. The reason this case belongs in a documentary about evil within families is simple. Before the public tragedy, there was a private one. A son made a decision inside his own house that shattered the most basic expectation of family life. That home is where you are safest in the aftermath. The investigation revealed a chilling theme that runs through many family cases. Even when the offender is young, the desire to erase resistance. Prosecutors argued that Mary was not targeted randomly. She was targeted because she represented rules, consequences, and intervention. That framing matters. It is what turns the case from a terrible day into something darker, an intentional step in a larger plan. The court would later hear how the timeline fit together, how the sequence of events was not spontaneous, and how the mother's death was tied to what came after. The public wanted one simple answer. Why? Why would a son do that to the person who gave him life? The truth is that courts rarely get a clean, satisfying motive in cases like this. What they do get is evidence of mindset, hostility, fantasies of power. The belief that other human beings are props in your personal story, not lives with value. In Luke Woodham's case, the state presented him as someone who had reached a point where he no longer saw his mother as a person. He saw her as a gatekeeper. In the end, the courtroom delivered the one thing the community demanded: permanent removal from society. Luke Woodham was sentenced to life without parole. That sentence is the legal equivalent of a locked door that never opens. No second chance. No aging out of the consequence. No future date circled on a calendar. Life without parole means the state decided that whatever explanations exist, whatever excuses are offered, they do not matter more than what was done. The cruelest part of family violence is that it does not just end a life. It rewrites every memory that came before it. Every holiday, every photograph, every ordinary moment becomes haunted by one final fact. The person you nurtured became the person who destroyed you. Mary Woodham should have had the ordinary future of a Mississippi mother. Watching her son graduate, watching him build a life, watching time soften the rough years of adolescence into something distant and survivable. Instead, her story ends in a courtroom record, and his story ends in a prison cell. Pearl will always be tied to that year. Not only because of what happened in public, but because of what happened behind a front door first. A reminder that evil does not always enter from the outside. Sometimes it grows inside the house, learns the layout, and waits for the moment it thinks nobody can stop it. Across Mississippi, these 10 cases stretch like a scar from the Gulf Coast up through pine woods, river counties, and small towns where everyone thinks they would notice danger before it arrived. But evil does not announce itself with a warning sign. It hides in marriages. It hides in last names. It hides in family routines. And then, one day, it turns the people closest to it into targets. In this documentary, the word family is not a comfort. It is the cover story. Lisa Jo Chamberlain and Roger Gillette turned a relationship into a two-person machine built for silence and disposal. A pair that proved love can become a weapon when both people share the same emptiness. Walter Simpson took a household and turned it into a crime scene, leaving behind a town that would spend years trying to understand how a man could erase the people who trusted him most. Carly Madison. Greg showed the most chilling form of betrayal. The calmness of someone treating a parent's phone like a tool after the worst decision of their life. A reminder that violence is not always loud. Sometimes it's cold, organized, and calculated. Dark Moore left Mississippi, staring at an old truth with fresh fear. When rage ignites inside a family circle, the damage spreads faster than anyone can run. Stephen McGilvery's case is proof that youth does not equal innocence. The courts had to wrestle with age, punishment, and what it means when a teenager destroys the very people meant to raise him. Willie Corey Godbolt turned a domestic dispute into a multi-scene nightmare, shattering the illusion that violence stays contained to one address. The Wallace brothers showed how loyalty can rot into a group mentality, where three men move like a unit and leave one person with no chance at mercy. Kendra Beck and Tokita Miller stand as a warning about the most basic duty that can be betrayed inside a home care, when the people responsible for protection become the source of harm. The household becomes a trap. Natasha Graham and Ronald Hartfield revealed the ugliest triangle of betrayal: a spouse, a lover, and a plot that treats marriage like something disposable when desire and cruelty align. And Luke Woodham closed the list with a case that still echoes through Mississippi history, not just for what the public witnessed, but for what began behind a front door, where a mother should have been safest. Here is the payoff that matters to every victim's loved ones. Cages. Some of the offenders on this list are sentenced to life without parole. Some are facing the harshest penalties the state can impose. Some will never again live as free people, not because time ran out, but because the justice system decided the risk they represent is permanent. That is the core promise of this series. Mississippi has places where the worst people go, and they do not come back. But no sentence repairs what was stolen, because the real cost of these cases is not measured in years behind bars. It is measured in birthdays that never arrive, in empty chairs at dinner tables, in phone numbers that will never ring again, in siblings and relatives who grow up carrying questions that have no answers strong enough to hold them. If there is one lesson that ties these 10 stories together, it is this: monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes they share your roof, sometimes they share your blood, and sometimes they count on that connection to get close enough to do the most damage. Mississippi will keep them behind razor wire, but the echo of what they did will live much longer than any sentence.